As we work toward the for loop, the next thing that we want to implement is the pre and post increment operators. We would like to be able to say I++ in our for loops. This turns out to be trickier than you might expect. One thing we're going to have to do here is implement dupop. There are 6 flavors of this in the JVM, and we're going to need all of them. What this does is duplicate a value or 1 or 2 values from the top of the stack and then insert those copies into the stack. The different flavors will duplicate 1 or 2 values, and they will insert the duplicate in different places on the stack. So the straight dupop is just going to duplicate 1 value and put it on top of the stack. Dupx1 will duplicate the top of the stack and insert it after skipping over 1 other value. So value 1 will be inserted below value 2 here. And dupx2 will skip 2 slots. So we're going to insert the copy of value 1 down here below values 2 and 3. The dup2 versions of these are going to duplicate 2 values on the stack, but otherwise they're basically the same. So we're going to duplicate value 1 and value 2 here. And then here we'll skip 1. So we're going to duplicate value 1 and value 2, but we'll skip over value 3. And then here we'll skip 2 values. So we're going to duplicate value 1 and 2 and insert them below values 3 and 4. So we need to implement that opcode. When we think about these increment operators, so we have 2 flavors, right? We have our pre-increment, which is going to increment the value first and then store it in the variable. And the value of this expression will also be the incremented value. So here, if x was 3, first we add 1 to x, it becomes 4, and then we assign that value to y. So x and y will both be 4 here. With post-increment, we're going to first use the value and then increment it afterward. So here, when we take x++, y will be assigned 3, and x will be incremented to 4. So x changes, but y actually gets the value from before the increment. This isn't so bad, but there are some more complicated variations of this that we also have to support. So we can increment the field in an object, or we could have a function call return an object and then increment a field in that object. We can increment a value in an array, or we could have a function that returns an array, and then we could increment a value in that array. Because of these function calls, we can't repeat the code for this expression, right? One way we could try to do this is we could run the code that evaluates object.field1, and that would be used to load the value, and then we could run that code again to sort of load up that field, and then we would store the new value into it. But because of these method calls, we can't do that, right? We can't call this function twice to get access to field 1. That might have side effects that could cause all kinds of weird stuff to happen. So we're going to have to save the information about the field that we're accessing and then use it to store the new value after the increment. And we'll have to do the same thing for the array. Trying to figure out exactly what instructions to use here and how to get the sequencing right is a pretty interesting problem. You should probably try to figure it out yourself. You need to work through all those cases, right? So we've got basically 6 cases, or really maybe 12 cases. We have basic local variable increment, and we need the pre and post increment, and we also need to handle the cases where we're not using the value and where we are using the value afterward. And then we need to do the same for the member access. So we have 4 flavors of that. And then the array access, there are 4 flavors. So try to work through those and write the VM opcodes that will get the job done, and see if you can figure it out. If you can't, or if you just don't want to, I'm going to go on now and show you how I did that in detail. So we have 3 cases. We have a local variable access, a field access, and an array access. For this one, we're going to have an iLoad and an iStore, which is pretty easy to handle. For the field, we need to do a get field and put field, but we also need the ID of the object we're dealing with. So we're going to need to duplicate that on the stack so we can use it twice. We'll need to use it for the load and then later for the store. Well, the get and the put. And then for the array, we're going to do an IA load and an IA store, but here we need the array object ID and the index. So we're going to have to duplicate both of those because we need to use them twice. So if we work through this one step by step, the pre-increment is really the same as x equals x plus 1. So this one we can load the value, push 1 and add that to our value, and then store it back into the variable. If we're using the result, we're going to need to duplicate that before we store it. So here we would do the addition, and then we would duplicate that new value and iStore will take the top copy and store it in the variable, and we're leaving the other copy on the stack, which will later be assigned to y, right? So there would be an iStore1 after this that stores the expression result. So when we walk through this, we're going to load x onto the stack, so we get 5. We push 1 and add it, so this becomes 6. Duplicate the value, we'll duplicate the 6. And then after the iStore, we'll still have a copy of 6 on the stack to be used for the assignment or in some larger expression. For post-increment, when we're not using the value, we don't really care that it's a post-increment, right? Plus plus x and x plus plus, if they're statements by themselves, really just add 1 to x, and it doesn't matter which one we're using. When we are using the value, we need to do the increment, but we need to use the previous value for our expression result, right? So if we're assigning it to something, that will get the old value. So the code we're going to run is this. We're going to load our value 5, duplicate it. We're going to increment the top one, so push 1 and add. And then we're going to store that back into the variable. So x has been updated to 6 here, but we left the old value on the stack so that it can be used in the expression. For fields, we're going to have the object ID on the stack, and we're going to need to use that when we do the put field at the end after the increment. So for a pre-increment by itself, we're going to load our object ID. We'll say it was ABCD. We're going to duplicate the ID to use it later. We're going to go get the field X. So that'll use up one of these IDs and load the value of the field. Then we're going to add 1 to it, push 1 and add. And then we'll put the field value back into M. So here we do a put field, and it will use the value and the ID that are sitting on top of the stack to update M.X. If we're using the value in an expression, we also need to duplicate the value and place it below the object ID on the stack. So we load the object ID and duplicate it. We go get the value of the field. We increment the value. Now we need to duplicate it, but we need to put the dupe below the object ID. So we're going to use the dupex1 instruction. And then after we do the store, 11 will be left on top of the stack to be used later. For a post increment here, again, when we're not using the value, it's the same as pre-increment. But when we use it, we need to copy the value before we do the increment instead of after here. So basically the increment code has been swapped. It's after our dupe instead of before the dupe. So we're going to load and duplicate the ID, load the field value, and then duplicate it below our object ID, increment it, and then do the put field, which will use up these two values. And then we have the old value sitting on top of the stack to be used in an expression. And then for arrays, we have to do sort of the same thing, but now we have to duplicate the ID and the index. So here we're going to load our ID and index onto the stack, and then we duplicate both. So we're doing a dupe2 here. We're going to load the array value. So we get 10. We're going to increment it, and then we can do our store, which will use the value, the index, and the array ID to update array sub5. If we want to use the value, we've got to duplicate it. So we're going to load our ID and index and duplicate them. We're going to go load our array value and increment it. Now we need to duplicate our value, but we're going to insert it below these two. So we need to do a dupex2 here. So 11 shows up down here. And then we store the value, and that leaves a copy on the stack to be used in an expression. And finally, in post-increment, again, if we don't use the value, it's the same code as pre-increment. But when we use it, now we need to duplicate the value before we increment it. So we're going to load the array and the index, duplicate those, and then do an IA load to go load the value. Then we're going to duplicate the original value and put it below everything else. So this is a dupex2. And then we're going to do our increment to the top value and go put that back in the array with an IA store. So the array value becomes 11. And then at the end, we have the old values sitting on top of the stack ready to be used for something else. So those are all the permutations. Now to write the code, we need to look at the similarities between those and try to come up with, the cleanest code we can. I mean, we could write out the code and have, I guess it was 9 cases that we need to deal with. So we could have a giant if with 9 cases that just generates the code, but we can actually do better than